Hello. Um, I'm just curious, like, how many of you guys actually like use Linux or like heard of Linux? Just like by show of hands. Okay, nice. Like, and how many of you like think like if you like use Linux but like you don't really know what you're doing? It's kind of like me. All right, cool. Okay, so what is Linux? Linux is an open source kernel. It's not actually an operating system. However, you have operating systems that are built on top of Linux, which we call distributions. So some common distributions that exist are Ubuntu, which is like Debian based. You have Fedora, that's Red Hat, and Arch, which is not Red Hat, but that's, yeah, that also exists. These are kind of like your like common like desktop operating systems that you would just daily drive. And then you also have like some more specialized operating systems such as Kali, you might have heard of. It's kind of like your hacking operating system. It's like a big toolbox of just hacker tools that you can use if you're like, for example, penetration testing. And a kernel is basically just a way to, for your hardware to interface with the software on your system. It also manages the software. Yeah. So why would you choose Linux? It's open source, so you can like find all the code on GitHub if you're curious. It also basically runs on anything. Because it's open source, there are a lot of, you can have like very specific distributions. So you might have one that is made for servers, and then you have another that can run on very little RAM or like resources that could maybe run on an old laptop. You also have the command line. The command line is great. It gives you so much control. You can pretty much do whatever you want on the system through it. And you also have package managers. These are like the primary way that you're going to install software onto the system. Yeah, this is like, I think it's way easier to use a package manager in my opinion than like go online and try to find like a download for some executable. You just basically run like one command and you can install the software that you want if it exists for it, if there's like a package for it. Linux also supports multi-user sessions by default, which unlike Windows. So you can have multiple users logged into one machine at the same time. So let's talk about the shell. The shell basically allows you to run commands on the operating system. Yeah, as I mentioned, it's really powerful and lightweight when you like compared to GUIs. And it might like seem intimidating at first, but once you get the hang of it, it's also like a lot faster because maybe if you're trying to make like a directory or like a folder, for example, instead of like having to go into like the GUI and like go through like a bunch of folders and like use it that way, you can just type in one command and it just makes it instantly. Yeah, some examples are like bash, zish, sh. Bash and like zsh are probably the most, or the two most common that you're gonna find. Sh is kind of like older. Bash is like the improved version. And typically you're gonna interact with a shell through a terminal emulator. So the shell is like the portion that kind of runs the commands on the operating system. However, to actually like give like keyboard input and like get like output from the shell, you're gonna typically use a terminal emulator. So let's talk about SSH. SSH stands for Secure Shell, and it's a protocol that allows encrypted communication or secure communication over an unsecure network. You can use this. The main way that you're probably going to use this is to gain remote access into or gain remote shell access into a machine that's running an SSH server. And the most like common like suite you're going to find is OpenSSH. Yeah, and in there you're going to find the SSH command, which you just SSH, you give it the username and then the host. By default, it'll run on port 22, but you can also specify a different port with the TAC-P flag, or if you have like a colon after your host. Yeah, and by default, SSH will use password authentication. However, it's recommended to use like public and private keys. It's like way easier because you don't have to remember a long password. And it also just gives you like cryptographic strength that like even a long password is not going to be able to provide. You also don't have to remember password. If you want to learn more, check out the man pages for SSH keygen and Google. There's a lot of good resources on how to set that up. All right. When you like first get onto a box, you're gonna want to know like what's happening around you. So you can use these as a reference and kind of get your bearings. So the ID command will just give you like user and group information. So you'll probably know what like user you're logged in as. However, if you want to like figure out like what groups you're part of, this is a good way. And you also have the pwd command, which will just give you the current working directory. That's basically like your path in the file system. So you know where you are. And then if you want network information, you can use IPA. If you only want like IP addresses, you can add the BR flag, like TAC BR, and that'll just like print out the interface with the IP address. You also have PS, which will just print process information. Processes on Linux are basically just like commands and programs that are running. So this is a good way to figure out like what's actually like happening on your system, and like maybe what that system is used for, if you don't already know. All right. Before we talk about like more commands in Linux, I'm going to mention the man pages. If you're ever in doubt and you don't know like what a command does, or you're confused about like some like function or utility, definitely check out the man pages first. They'll give you a lot of good detailed information on like that command or utility. And oftentimes, I know Red Team will just like read man pages to like get ideas for tools, and like just use like the already existing functionality in sort of like a malicious way. You also have like apropos or like man tac k. It's just like search the man pages and like descriptions for some keyword. So maybe you know like, or you think you might know some functionality exists. You can use that to like look for that functionality if you don't have like maybe access to Google already. Yeah. All right, let's talk about the file system. So the Linux file system is like structured like a tree with the base at root, which is that /. And this is like your top level directory. Everything else is contained in here. And yeah, pretty much. You might have also heard that everything on Linux is a file, which is almost true. You got like files, which are obviously files. Your directories are files. Executables are files. Configurations, like sockets, those are all files. Processes have files, but they're not exactly files. They're more like memory that's been mapped to files. Yeah. And you also, another important idea about the file system is relative versus absolute paths. So this is kind of important for if you want to like navigate it. Relative paths are basically just based on your current working directory, and then absolute paths are based on the root directory. Kind of like an easy way to distinguish is if you have like a / at the start of your at the start of the path, maybe if you're like seeding into it, you'll know that's probably an absolute path. And if you don't have one, it's probably a relative path. Yeah. So let's talk about some fun paths. So for absolute paths, you have the file system root. This is important because, as I mentioned, everything is contained in here. You can't go like higher than this. You also have like etc, which contains system-wide configs. /home is like the user's personal directories. Most of the time, at least I do, I spend most of my time in home if I have like my own personal files. You also have proc or /proc, which is pretty important. It contains information about the running system and also process information. It's basically a way that you can interface with the kernel or like internal kernel data structures. And you also have bin and user bin and like sbin and user sbin. A lot of the times I find that like bin and sbin just link or like point to user bin, user sbin. And the main difference between these two is that bin is just like normal binaries, while sbin contains like administrative binaries, those that you would need like root permissions to run. And you also have some shortcuts. That tilde is just a user's home directory. It's the same as the it's the same as the home environment variable, which I will talk about environment variables on a later slide. And you also have like the tilde with a dash or the dash. That's just like the previous directory that you were in. And you have two like main relative paths on Linux, I would say. Like the dot is just your current working directory, and then the dot is the parent directory. You also have like more relative paths than that. For example, if you're like in your home directory and you cd into, if you want to cd into maybe like your downloads, you'd probably do that through a relative path because you just supply it with downloads. So let's look at an example of navigating the file system. Well, actually before that, you really have like two commands that you only there's really like two commands that you need, cd and ls. cd, change directory, like change into a different path, and ls, just list contents. Typically, ls has like two like main flags that you might provide it, the a flag and the l flag, or option maybe. The a just specify or like shows entries that start with that period or with the dot, and then l lists like additional information. Maybe it'll list like when that file was like last accessed, or like who owns the file permissions, like what type of file it is. And if we look in this example, we can see that currently we're in home Aleksi example. And if we ls, we'll see that we have this subdir. So we can cd into that subdir with a relative path. And then if we look at our current directory again, we'll see that we're in subdir. And if we look at or like list all the entries in that directory, we'll see those two relative paths I mentioned earlier. And we can cd into the parent with the two dots. And then if we cd into etc, we provide it with an absolute path because we have that / in the beginning of it. And then we'll see that we're in etc. We can cd back and then cd into home with the tilde. Also, if you don't want to if you want to just like be quick about cd, if you're just like going into your home directory, you don't even have to provide the tilde. By default, cd will just like, if you don't provide it a path, it'll just read from the home environment variable. So you can just type in cd, it'll just cd into your home. And if you want to cd into like a different user's home directory, you can provide the name of the user after that tilde. All right, let's talk about find. Find will search the directory tree at a given starting point and evaluate the options. It's very useful if you want to just find some file that you know might exist, but you don't know where it is. There's a lot of functionality in this, so I definitely recommend checking out the man pages if you want to learn more. But some common options include like name or iname. Iname is cool because you can provide it like with wildcards, so this like asterisk. Type, search for a file with a specific type. Maybe you want to find like only directories, so you provide it with like the D flag. If you want to like see all the types, you can look at the man pages, or like the man page for find. It'll list all of them. Perm, just look for files with some specific like permission bits. User, user and group, like files owned by like a user or like a group. And mmin is kind of cool as well. It'll look for files that are modified like less than, more than, or exactly n minutes ago. You can specify that like less than or more than if you add like a plus or minus in front, and exactly with just n. This can be pretty cool if you're like maybe blue teaming and you know that red team modifies some file and you want to look for a file that's been modified by red team like less than like 2 minutes ago, for example. You could use it. You can use this command to look for those files. And you also have the which command. It'll just show you the absolute path of the command that it would have ran in the command flag or argument. So users and groups. Users and groups on Linux are ways to implement access control on the system. Users have a unique user ID or UID, and information about them is stored in etc group or etc password. Or sorry, etc password and etc shadow. And etc password basically just contains user information, like maybe the user and like the group, or user ID, like group ID, stuff like that. And shadow contains the password hashes of the users. I think they used to be an etc password, that's why it's called like that, but it's not secure anymore, so they moved it to shadow, which is you can't read that by everybody, or everyone can't read that unlike etc password. Every user also has like a primary group and can be added up to 15 secondary groups. I kind of just made this distinction because when I talk about file permissions, it's kind of like a bit of a nuance. Yeah, and also groups have a unique group ID or GID. Yeah, you can basically use these to organize users with common access permissions, and group information is stored in etc group. Another one important user that you should know about is the root user. They have a UID of 0. They can do pretty much anything on the system. Maybe the only limitation is something that the kernel hasn't been coded to do. But if you want to add your own functionality, you can just write a kernel module and load that into the system that way. However, you don't always want to be running as the root user because you want to have or implement the idea of least privilege. You might have heard about that or learned about that in your 140 class. So what you would do is use sudo. Sudo basically just allows you to run commands as root. Yeah, so for example, if you wanted to like let only a specific user run specific commands, you would use sudo. Or you could like configure that through etc sudoers so that they only have those permissions. And also, you can list your permissions with the -l flag or argument. And this could be useful, for example, if you're doing a hack the box or like a try hack me, and you're trying to like privilege escalate, you could like list your sudo permissions with the -l flag, and maybe you get like an easy privilege escalation that way. Some helpful, this is just kind of like a dump of commands. You can use this as a reference if you'd like, but like 3 of the more important ones maybe are user mod, which just allows you to modify a user account. So for example, you want to change the username of some user, you can use user mod to do that. And then the other 2 are chmod and chown. Chmod allows you to change file permissions, and chown allows you to change the file owner and group. A common like example is if you write like a script, like a shell script, and you want to make it executable, you'll do like chmod plus x, and then give it that script, and then you can execute it. Yeah. All right, let's talk about file permissions. So file permissions basically tell you which users can read, write, and execute a given file. And you can view them with ls-tech-l or stat. Yeah, so file permissions have like 3 sets of file permissions for each file. 1 for the owner, 1 for the group, and then 1 for other users or like everybody else on the system. And then these file permissions each have like 3 file permission bits, I guess you could say. And then you can represent them as octal notation. An octal number is just 3 bits. So you can think of the execute bit as the first bit, the write bit as a second, and then the read as a third. So the execute would be like 2 to the 0, and then you would get write would be 2 to the first, and then read would be 2 squared. So that's how you get that 7 as a maximum number. And if you look at our example here, we have read, write, execute for the owners. The owner can read, write, execute. The owner's primary group can read and write, and then everyone else can just read. So this would be 764 because the owner has all 3 permission bits set, so it'd be 4 plus 2 plus 1. The owner's primary group has just the read and write bits, so it'd be 4 plus 2 is 6, and then everybody else has 4, which is just read. Yeah. Does that make sense? Okay. Anybody have any questions so far? No? Okay, cool. So interacting with files. So the main way that you're gonna like interact with files is probably through like a text editor if you want to like create or edit a file. You can also use like touch to like just create an empty file, but that's not really what it's like used for, I guess. But that's also like a added functionality. This is also just kind of like a dump of commands that you could use as a reference. However, I would say like cat through make dir. Like if you know like those 5 commands, like cat, move, remove, copy, and make dir, you can probably like do most things that you would want on the system. Less is also a pretty useful command because let's say if you're blue teaming, this happened to me when I was blue teaming RITSEC last year. I wanted to like read a file, but the terminal wouldn't allow me to like look at the full file, and I couldn't scroll in the terminal either. So what you can do is if you like cat that file, and then you can pipe the output of that file to less. I'll talk about pipes at a later slide, but you can pipe that output to less, and then you can use that to scroll through the file. It could also be faster than some like text editors because it doesn't actually have to read the whole file before it like displays output. And tail and head, those could be like pretty useful if you just want like the first part or like the last part of a file. And file is also like kind of useful, just determine file type. So if you like file a directory, it'll just tell you it's a directory. Or you file an executable, it'll tell you it's an executable. Yeah. grep is another very common command that you're going to use. Basically, allows you to use regex to search for patterns in a file. Regex, if you don't already know, it's like kind of just how do you say it? Pattern. Kind of like a bunch of symbols that like match a pattern, I would say. And you can use, it's very useful to learn, even outside of just Linux. There's a good site that I like to use, like regex 101. It kind of just like teaches you and like walks you through, or it makes it very easy to actually like write regex that works. And this is like useful maybe if you're like parsing a log file. You can like find some specific text in that file. And yeah, it can also take redirected output. There's like a common way that you're going to use it. So as I mentioned, like maybe you cat some like directory or a cat some file, and then you pipe that output to grep, and then you grep for some pattern in there. But yeah. RipGrep is another cool tool. It's like similar. It allows you to, by default, recursively search a directory for some regex pattern. It's kind of like find, where it like recursively searches that directory. However, it's like with regex. This is like useful if you need Unicode support, because it like stays fast. You can grep for Unicode with, you can use grep and use that to grep for Unicode. However, it's going to be pretty slow. So if you want it to like stay fast, you can use ripgrep. So in that example, if we look at that, we're basically grepping for some pattern in some directory, and we spew all the output of the files that match that, the file and like the line number in that file that match that pattern. So some other stuff. Pipes and redirection. You can redirect the input and output of a process like to and from files. Processes have like 3 standard streams: the standard in, standard out, and standard error. You can kind of like think of these as ways to like interact and like send information and receive information from processes. And you can use like the caret characters, like the left and right carets, to redirect the output from a file or to a file. So this, the single right caret will overwrite the contents of the file. So if in our example, if we do ls tech a and then we write those contents or write the output of that command to the contents.txt, it's gonna overwrite the contents. But if you did like a double caret or double right bracket, it would just append those contents. Processes also output to standard out and standard error. I recently learned this when I was like researching for this presentation. You can actually like output just if you want to like output the errors to like a specific file, you can specify the file descriptor, which is kind of file descriptor for standard out, which is 2. It's just like, it's just like a number given to that stream. And you can output the errors to its specific file and then output the rest of the normal output to output.txt. And in the second example, we have the ampersand because if we didn't have that, it would just output it to a file called 1. So we have the ampersand so that it outputs to the standard in, so that all the output gets put into all output.txt. And you can also use like the single left bracket or single left bracket or I don't know, arrow thing to input the file contents to a command. Maybe you have some program that by default doesn't read from a file, but you still have a file. You want to like input those file contents. You can use this to pass those file contents from standard into that program. And another very common operator I got maybe is like the pipe. This is like just like that big like dash or line. Basically allows you to chain the output of one command to like the input of another. So in our example, we like ls our directory, and then we input the output of ls to grep, and then we grep for some file.txt. So it'll just like filter out the output of ls. Environment variables. Basically, environment variables allow you to store information used by processes. And yeah, you kind of have like 2 types, I would say, of environment variables. You have like global environment variables, which are just for all users on a system. And you have like per user environment variables, which can be set like through a user shell config. which is like the .bashrc or .zshrc that's located in your home directory. A shell config just runs on startup, and then like runs a bunch of commands related to your shell to like set it up, basically, sort of. And you can like, if you want to set like global environment variables, you can do it through like Etsy profile or Etsy environment. However, Etsy profile is probably gonna like recommend you just make a simple like shell script or like make a script in like the Etsy profile D if you want to do it that way. Yeah. You can also environment variables can also be set for like a specific process only. So if you're like setting them through the shell, you can set them for like the shell process only, or you can set them for any sub processes that you run from the shell, which would be like commands and like programs by using the export command. I think you might be able to also do this through like the env command. I haven't like looked at that too much though. Yeah. So in our, if we look here, like we set the actually I have an example on the next slide. I'll just show that. Yeah, you can also just unset them with unset. So if we look, and yeah, if you want to list them, print env or export p. So in our example here, we have this like Python script that will just look for this myvar environment variable and print it if it exists. Otherwise, it'll just print like unable to access myvar. So when we just run it, we'll see that no myvar is set. And if we just try to set a myvar environment variable without actually exporting it, and we run the Python script, it's gonna be unable to access that environment variable. However, once we run export myvar, it's gonna be able to access it because it exports that environment variable to the subprocess. Subprocess's environment, so it's able to access it. Yeah. So process control. This is another kind of important topic. Basically, PS, as I mentioned, allows you to see running processes and related information. It's kind of like a snapshot of the processes that are currently running on the system. And it reads from the proc like file system, which I mentioned earlier. It contains those process information on the system, which is managed by the kernel. You also have kill, which you can use to terminate a process. So you can send a specific, send like a specific signal to that process. It'll send sigterm by default, which will just terminate it. However, if you want, you could also send sigkill, just like absolutely nuke the process. Not recommended though. You also have top, which is kind of like more of a real-time view of running processes. It's like somewhat interactive. You can kill processes with the K key. You also have htop. These are kind of like similar to like the task manager, I guess you could think of them, that you have on Windows. Yeah. So package managers, these are basically the primary way that you're gonna install like additional software and update your system as well. Packages are basically just contain all the files that are needed to run and like set up a certain piece of software on that system. And packages often have dependencies, which are just additional packages required for that like software to run. And yeah, these are kind of like maybe if you have like Debian or like Ubuntu, you're gonna use like the apt command. Fedora uses DNF and Arch uses pacman. So does Manjaro, which is Arch based. And update software, you have to do both. For apt, you have to do both. You have to do apt update and apt upgrade. Update will, I believe, just update like the repositories which contain all the software, and then upgrade will actually like upgrade the packages on your system. Yeah, similarly for DNF upgrade and pacman. So, downloading files. Let's say you want to like download a file from the internet. You can use wget, which is made specifically for downloading files. Yeah, you just give it like the URL, and in our example, it would just download that file.txt to a file called file.txt. It supports HTTPS and FTP, I believe, or in HTTP. And you also have curl. This is a very like versatile tool. like it's much more versatile than just downloading files. It allows you to like transfer data to and from a server with URLs. It supports a lot more protocols than just wget, but it does also support HTTP. And if you, the two like main arguments or options that you would give it if you want to like output the, or actually I should say, by default, like curl will just like, if you curl a URL, it'll just like print the contents of that like URL that it receives to the screen. However, if you want to like save those contents to a file, you can use the tag O, like lowercase o flag, and like give it a file to save those contents to. So here, if we, in our example, we're just like saving basically like the source of example.com to a file called file. And we also have the tag O flag, which just basically writes output to a file that's named like the remote file. So it would just save the file name contents to a file called file name. All right. Some tips and tricks. These are kind of just making your life easier when you're using the shell. Control C will just like kill the current command. Control D will exit. It kind of just sends an end of file, so it stops reading from that file stream. Control L, it's the same as the clear command, which is kind of like empties your terminal. It makes it nice and clean. And then Control Z, I didn't really talk about this much, or I haven't like, this is, or yeah, it'll like suspend a process. You can use like the FG command to, it'll like put that process into the background. And then if you want to bring it back into the foreground, you can use the FG command. You can also list like backgrounded jobs with the jobs command. And then you also have tab. Tab is very, very nice on Linux because it just allows you to autocomplete or show autocomplete suggestions. So let's say maybe you're like looking for some like, if you like type in man and then you do like, you hit tab twice, it'll like show you all like the suggestions for like the man pages that you could read through. And also like if you're like seeding into some directory, you can like I just kind of spam tab because I mess up writing or like I do a lot of spelling mistakes. You also have history, which will just show command history. Pretty simple. And then if you want to search through that history, you can use it. You can use Control R and just like look for some previous commands that you ran. Some more tips and tricks. So if you want to run the previous command, you do like the double bang or bang bang. It's like bang is just like exclamation point. The exclamation point. I don't know why it's called that, but it is. I guess it's easier to say. And if you, a very common example is like if you run a command and you actually just need sudo privileges, you just type in sudo bang bang, and then you can rerun the previous command with sudo. You can also like rerun some like the 5th command from your history if you like, or like the nth command from your history by providing like bang and then that number. And then the bang thing, rerun like the previous command starting with thing. You can also replace you can rerun the previous command and replace this with that if you provide the carets. And yeah, the question mark X or $ question mark will just give you like the return value of the previous command. This could be useful if you're like writing some script and you want to see like if it exited properly, for example. And alias is also pretty cool. This could probably have its like own slide, but I just added it in here. Basically, you can substitute a command for like a word. So if you have some like command that you're running a lot like repetitively, you can use the alias to just substitute it, make it simpler. You're also probably just using aliases a lot without even knowing it. If you just run the alias command, it'll just like list all the aliases that are on your system. And yeah, I alias like dot to cd dot because it's just, I'm lazy and it's way easier to type it. Yeah, so more resources. I definitely recommend checking out the previous year's presentations if you want to learn more. They have like a lot of good information that I probably missed, and they're also just like different perspectives. And if you want to like get your feet wet, I think Over the Wire Bandit is a good way. It's just like kind of like CTF style. And there's a bunch of like challenges that allow you to like get comfortable using like the shell. And yeah, another like good way to learn is if you just like install Arch to like a VM. Yeah, that's like kind of like a deep dive. It'll teach you a lot as well. Yeah, any questions? That's the end of it.